Welcome to The Debate. Today, we are examining a strategic concept that has, well, it's spent decades sounding like pure science fiction. But due to a massive shift in aerospace economics and, frankly, global geopolitics, it has become a pressing reality of modern military architecture. We're talking about rods from God.
Right, or as it's known in the declassified literature, Project Thor, or hypervelocity rod bundles.
Exactly. And the premise is starkly straightforward. It involves dropping 20-foot-long, 24,000-pound solid tungsten cylinders from low Earth orbit. Traveling at Mach 10, a single rod strikes the Earth with the kinetic energy equivalent of 11.5 tons of TNT. So it completely eliminates a hardened target without generating a single atom of radioactive fallout.
And is absolutely vital to recognize the specific moment in history in which we are having this discussion. I mean, today is March 8, 2026. Just over a month ago, on February 5, 2026, the New START treaty between the United States and Russia officially expired.
Yeah, a massive shift.
It's unprecedented. For the first time since the early 1970s, the world's largest strategic arsenals are operating without legally binding limits. And more importantly, without a verification architecture. That vacuum fundamentally alters how we have to view emerging ultra-fast capabilities in space.
It really does, which brings us directly to our central question. Given the absolute collapse of orbital launch costs and the concurrent dissolution of that New START verification architecture, does the deployment of orbital kinetic bombardment represent a logical, unstoppable, and perhaps necessary evolution of strategic deterrence? Or does it trigger a fundamentally destabilizing and uniquely dangerous qualitative arms race? I argue that kinetic orbital weapons are the inevitable and mathematically elegant endpoint of military strategy. They're made entirely viable by modern aerospace economics and, crucially, perfectly legal under current international treaties.
And I take the position that deploying these unkillable, uninterruptible weapons through a treaty loophole invites a catastrophic and entirely unverifiable arms race in a newly contested domain.
To really understand why this is happening now, we have to look at the economic barrier that just evaporated. The realization of Project Thor is really a triumph of aerospace economics over outdated conventional warfare paradigms. Jerry Pournelle originally proposed this in the 1950s and 60s, and, well, the physics were always sound, but it was blocked by launch costs. During the space shuttle era, putting mass into low Earth orbit cost roughly $54,000 per kilogram.
Right. At those prices, dropping solid tungsten from orbit was just a thought experiment for defense contractors. The math worked, but the budget absolutely didn't.
Precisely. But today, the landscape has entirely transformed. Look at what SpaceX's Starship platform has done with rapid reusability. We are looking at projections driving launch costs down to between $13 and $32 per kilogram. When you run the logistics on that new reality, a fully operational, nuclear battery-powered, spin-stabilized orbital kinetic strike platform carrying 6 10-ton tungsten rods now costs roughly $210 to $250 million to deploy.
Which is a remarkably low threshold for a strategic weapon. I mean, that's incredibly cheap.
It is the price of just 2.5 F-35 Lightning II fighter jets. And think about the strategic trade-off here. Replacing highly vulnerable single-theater fighter jets with a permanent 24-hour global deterrent is an undeniable necessity. An F-35 requires a massive logistics tail. It can be jammed, it can be grounded by weather, it can be shot down by advanced surface-to-air missiles. A tungsten rod falling from orbit is just an inevitable physical fact.
I come at it from a different way. Because that profound economic accessibility you just outlined is exactly what makes the system terrifyingly destabilizing. We have officially entered what the Tufts University Center for Strategic Studies identifies as a qualitative arms race. We aren't measuring strategic power in megatonnage or mushroom clouds anymore. We are measuring it in stealthy, co-orbital anti-satellite capabilities and these kinetic rods.
But isn't a shift away from nuclear yield toward precision kinetic energy inherently safer? You remove the fallout.
Not when you look at the geopolitical realities in orbit right now. China's on-orbit presence has grown over 1,000% since 2015. Just last year, Russia launched Cosmos 2588 specifically to shadow United States military satellite demonstrating clear, hostile co-orbital intercept capabilities. The domain is already a powder keg. When you introduce a weapon like a tungsten rod that provides only 11 seconds of warning from ground detection to a Mach 10 impact, you entirely remove diplomatic reaction time. You turn the sky into a perpetual, unconstrained threat where the margin for error is simply zero.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the institutional logic at play here. This isn't a sudden, destabilizing shift. It is the natural continuation of a deeply embedded American strategic logic. Look at the historical precedent set in Hastings, Nebraska.
Hastings? You're talking about the powder drink mix? How does Kool-Aid connect to orbital bombardment?
It connects perfectly through the logic of concentration and invisibility. Back in 1927, Edwin Perkins took enormous potential, concentrated it into powder form in Hastings, and created Kool-Aid. The methodology was simple. Reduce something to its most easily deliverable form, add water, and let chemistry do the rest. 15 years later, the United States Navy applied that exact same logic to military power on the exact same prairie. They built the Naval Ammunition Depot on 49,000 acres, eventually storing over 40% of the Navy's entire munitions in hidden concrete igloos.
Okay, I follow the institutional logic. They concentrated destructive potential and placed it inland where no one was looking.
Exactly. They relied on geographic centrality and the invisibility of the plains. Orbit is simply the new prairie. We are taking immense destructive potential, concentrating it into a simple elemental mass, hiding it in the ultimate invisible high ground, and letting gravity do the rest. It is the exact same logistical philosophy, just scaled up to low Earth orbit.
But Hastings had geographic limits. It was isolated, yes, but it was bound by the Earth. And let's not forget, it wasn't perfectly safe either. In September of 1944, a catastrophic explosion tore through that depot. 9 men died, and a crater 500 feet wide opened in the Earth. The blast was felt 100 miles away. Geography contained the threat to a specific, understood location. Orbit has no limits.
Which makes it the ultimate sanctuary for a deterrent.
A sanctuary that produces an unmitigatable threat. A tungsten rod falling from low Earth orbit has no pilot you can recall. It has no fuel you can restrict to limit its range. It possesses no electronics that your adversary can jam, and no explosive warhead that can be diffused or intercepted.
I would argue that is exactly why it is necessary. It bypasses the friction of conventional warfare entirely.
But if a conventional defense system attempts to shoot it down, if they somehow manage to fragment a 24,000-pound cylinder moving at hypersonic velocities, it doesn't neutralize the threat. It just creates a hypersonic shotgun blast that covers the exact same target area. The scale of vulnerability here is unprecedented because the weapon doesn't play by the rules of interception.
During the Cold War, the persistent, unsolved dilemma for strategic planners was how to neutralize deeply buried command bunkers. Orbital kinetic platforms solve this definitively. By utilizing an electromagnetic railgun on the satellite bus, the system spin stabilizes the rod at several thousand revolutions per minute before releasing it.
Creating a gyroscopic stability so it doesn't tumble during atmospheric reentry.
Exactly. It strikes nose first. And because we are dealing with a Mach 10 impact, the material science is extraordinary. The combination of shear velocity and rotational energy converts the tungsten nose tip, which already boasts a melting point of over 6,100 degrees Fahrenheit, by the way, into a plasma state upon impact. We aren't just talking about punching through reinforced concrete, it liquefies it. The rod flows through the Earth like a hot nail through wax, reaching depths of hundreds of feet. It flawlessly reaches targets that even our most advanced nuclear Earth penetrators cannot reliably destroy.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why the ability to effortlessly destroy hardened targets is a strategic nightmare, not a solution. Having a weapon that perfectly destroys any deeply buried facility globally in a matter of minutes doesn't secure peace. It guarantees paranoia.
But deterrence is built on the credible threat of destruction. If they know we can reach their bunkers, they won't act.
That assumes a stable verification environment, which we don't have. Remember the context we established at the top of the discussion. The New START verification architecture dissolved on February 5th. There are no on-site inspections. There is no transparency mechanism left. If a nation places a constellation of these platforms in orbit, adversaries have no choice but to assume those platforms are fully armed and currently targeting their deepest, most secure command and control centers.
That is just the nature of a contested domain.
It compresses the decision-making window to zero. When a nuclear-armed nation believes its leadership could be decapitated with only 11 seconds of warning and they have no treaty mechanisms to verify the status of the threat hovering right above them, their only logical response is a hair-trigger posture. It replaces a stable, understood standoff with perpetual existential dread. You force the adversary to adopt a launch-on-warning protocol because waiting to confirm an attack means their command structure is already liquefied.
We have to separate the strategic anxiety of our adversaries from the legal architecture that actually governs the sky. You mention a lack of treaties, but we must acknowledge the foundational instrument that remains firmly in place, and that is the 1967 Outer Space Treaty,
which was designed specifically to keep the Cold War out of orbit.
Yes. And Article 4 of that treaty is highly explicit in its prohibitions. It forbids placing nuclear weapons or weapons of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth. But let's look at the actual system we are discussing. A 20-foot tungsten cylinder contains no nuclear material. It contains no biological agents and no chemical compounds. It contains no explosive whatsoever. It is simply elemental metal.
But the effect is akin to a tactical nuclear strike without the radiation.
Under any recognized international legal definition, the electromagnetic railgun on the satellite bus is a propulsion system, and the tungsten rod is an inert mass. The destruction on the ground is purely a product of physics, gravity, and velocity, not a prohibited substance. The treaty simply does not prohibit this system. It is perfectly legal.
But that's a compelling argument, but have you considered the profound historical and contextual intent of that treaty? Look at the metaphor of Yisrael from the source material. The name literally translates to one who struggles with God, derived from the story of Jacob wrestling through the night and emerging limping but blessed. The Outer Space Treaty was humanity wrestling with the absolute terror of the 1960s. It was drafted directly under the shadow of the Cuban Missile Crisis to keep the apocalypse out of orbit.
But international law operates on the text, not the shadow of the 1960s.
Legal analysts at West Point's Lieber Institute explicitly call the omission of conventional orbital weapons a significant loophole. Exploiting this loophole betrays the entire peaceful purposes intent of the treaty framework. To argue that a weapon delivering 11.5 tons of TNT equivalents at Mach 10 is perfectly acceptable simply because it relies on kinetic energy rather than splitting the atom is a dangerous game. It assumes that because something is technically legal under a strict textualist reading, it is strategically wise. It honors the letter of the law while completely obliterating its spirit.
The spirit of warfare naturally trends toward efficiency and simplicity. What we are witnessing with hypervelocity rod bundles is simply the fulfillment of Albert Einstein's famous prophecy. He stated that he did not know with what weapons World War III would be fought, but that World War IV would be fought with sticks and stones.
Usually interpreted as a warning about civilizational collapse and nuclear regression.
Exactly. For decades, we read it as a warning that nuclear fire would bomb us back to the Stone Age. But the deeper truth, when you look at the physics of orbital bombardment, is that Einstein was describing a recursive logic inherent to the physics of destruction. Every era of warfare eventually strips away its own complexity. It discards the volatile chemistry, the intricate fusing, the explosive compounds, and returns to the oldest, simplest equation. A heavy thing, moving fast, aimed at a target. The rod is the stick. It just happens to be made of tungsten, and the stone is dropped from 300 miles up. Because gravity is free and launch costs have absolutely collapsed, we are looking at a clean, hyper-efficient deterrent that the modern military apparatus simply cannot afford to ignore.
The combination of this hyper-efficient, unstoppable technology with the complete collapse of the New START arms control framework leaves global security profoundly limping. We have traded the verifiable, inspected treaties of the past 50 years for an unconstrained sky full of unkillable hypersonic weapons. Yes, the economic barrier has evaporated. Yes, the legal gap in the Outer Space Treaty is wide enough to drop a 12,000-kilogram telephone pole through. But substituting mutual transparency for a silent, permanent threat hovering overhead is a profound strategic mistake. The most dangerous aspect of Project Thor isn't the physics. The physics have been understood since the 1950s. The danger is the unprecedented combination of immense accessibility and complete invisibility.
We certainly share an understanding of the profound shift currently underway in the modern military landscape. The physics of destruction have indeed simplified, reverting to foundational textbook mechanics, even as the geopolitical landscape down here on Earth has grown infinitely more complex and fractured.
Absolutely. We are standing at a threshold where technological capability and aerospace logistics have fundamentally outpaced our diplomatic and legal frameworks, leaving us to navigate an entirely new and highly volatile domain of human conflict.
There is an incredible amount of nuance here regarding orbital mechanics, the history of Cold War deterrence strategy, and international space law. We highly encourage you to dive into the source material to explore these intersections and the technical realities of kinetic bombardment for yourself. Thank you for joining us for this intellectual exchange.
Thank you for listening.
I want you to start off today by doing a little mental exercise with me. Just play along for a second. Imagine the quietest, most unassuming place you can possibly think of.
Like a place where absolutely no one is looking.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe it's a vast empty field or a quiet stretch of highway at 3 in the morning. Or even just that sleepy little town you drive through where nothing ever really seems to happen. Take a second to picture it.
Got it.
Okay, now, in your mind's eye, I want you to look up. Just look straight up at the sky.
It's a peaceful image on the surface,
Yeah.
But there is a profoundly unsettling reality hiding inside that exact vantage point.
And that reality is what we are digging into today.
Yeah.
Because today is March 8th, 2026. And exactly 1 month ago, just 1 month, a massive, almost completely silent shift in global security took place.
Right, and it didn't happen with explosions or sirens, no breaking news alerts.
No, it happened with the quiet expiration of a piece of paper. And it connects directly to those stars right above your head. So today's deep dive is centered around a highly detailed 2026 geopolitical and strategic assessment. The document is titled Rods from God, Kinetic Bombardment, the Death of Arms Control, and the Architecture of the Unconstrained Sky.
It's quite a title.
It really is. And our mission for this session is to basically unpack how a 1950s science fiction concept has quietly become a very, very real military capability right now in 2026.
We're going to break down the history, the physics of it.
The crashing economics of space travel.
Yeah, and the legal loopholes that are actually allowing these orbital kinetic weapons to materialize today. What's fascinating here is that this shift forces a complete re-examination of modern deterrence. We aren't looking at a simple upgrade to an existing system.
Like swapping out a jet engine for a faster one.
Exactly. It's not that.
Yeah.
We're looking at a fundamental shift in how humanity measures and manages destructive power. It's a departure from the chemical and nuclear anxieties of the 20th century. We're returning to a mechanism of destruction that is ancient, incredibly simple, and crucially, currently, completely unconstrained by international law.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to really understand the sheer scale of this, we actually need to ground ourselves before we look at orbit.
Right.
The historical baseline for this entire strategic philosophy doesn't start in a classified Pentagon briefing room. It starts in a small town in the American Midwest in the 1920s. We're looking at Hastings, Nebraska.
Which seems like a massive jump, I know.
Yeah.
But Hastings establishes the central logic of everything that follows.
Yeah.
Geographically, it sits on the plains, nearly at the exact center of the continental United States. It's equidistant from the Pacific and Atlantic coasts. It's the kind of place that conventional histories of American military power just tend to gloss over entirely.
But in 1927, right on West 1st Street, you had this inventor named Edwin Perkins. And he was trying to solve a logistics problem.
He wanted to figure out how to ship a liquid drink concentrate across the country without paying the exorbitant freight costs.
Because shipping heavy water is just incredibly expensive.
Right. Water weight is the enemy of shipping. So Perkins reformulated his product. He dehydrated it. He extracted the water entirely, producing a powdered drink mix in small packets.
And he called it Kool-Aid, originally spelled with an E, by the way.
Kool-Aid with an E, yeah.
Yeah.
And the invention of that drink mix represents a highly specific philosophy. It's the logic of concentration.
Right.
Perkins realized that you could take an enormous amount of potential, in his case, sweetness and flavor, and reduce it down to its absolute simplest, lightest, most deliverable form. You ship the concentrated powder, you mix it with a natural, widely abundant force like water at the destination, and you just let basic chemistry do the rest of the work.
I love that. Hastings understood that logic of concentration 15 years before the federal government ever even arrived. Because by 1942, right in the thick of the Second World War, the U.S. military was desperately looking for a place to build a new, massive ammunition depot.
And they chose the exact same prairie where Perkins mixed his crystals.
It's wild. They established the Naval Ammunition Depot, the NAD, just southeast of Hastings. And the scale of this facility is staggering. We are talking about 49,000 acres of flat, completely concealed inland terrain.
At its operational peak, this facility in the middle of the Nebraska plains was the single largest inland ammunition depot in the entire country.
Wow.
It produced and stored over 40% of the U.S. Navy's munitions for the entire war.
40%.
Almost half of the explosive capability the Navy utilized in both the Pacific and the Atlantic theaters originated from one facility hidden in the tall grass.
You look at the logistical footprint, and it reads like a small city dedicated entirely to high explosives. They had 2,000 buildings, including hundreds of concrete igloo-style storage magazines embedded directly into the prairie earth.
They laid down 207 miles of private railroad track just to move bombs, torpedoes, and 40-millimeter shells.
And 10,000 workers were operating that facility 24 hours a day. It's unbelievable.
But the strategy of utilizing the prairie relies on a few core tenets that are really important to remember. First is the inland placement. By placing 40% of your naval munitions in the geographic center of the continent, you neutralize the threat of coastal bombardment.
Because in 1942, the fear of U-boats or carrier strikes on the coasts was a very real thing.
Exactly. A submarine cannot strike Nebraska.
Right.
Second is the geographic centrality. Sitting on those major continental rail lines meant you had rapid, equal-distance distribution to either coast, depending on where the munitions were needed most.
Yeah.
But the third, and perhaps most crucial strategic element, was invisibility.
Defense by obscurity.
Yes. The government banked heavily on the assumption that adversaries simply don't look at the middle of the country. It was defense through the sheer vastness and perceived emptiness of the American plains.
Hastings was chosen because literally no one was looking. It's that same logic of concentration we saw with the drink mix. You reduce an enormous amount of destructive potential into its most deliverable form, artillery shells and bombs in this case. You bury it where no one can see it, and you let the logistics network distribute that force.
However, burying all that potential energy doesn't render it tame. There was a documented event from September of 1944 where a catastrophic explosion tore through a section of the depot.
Right, I read about this. 9 men were killed instantly.
The blast was so incredibly powerful that it opened a crater 500 feet wide in the earth, and the shockwave was felt 100 miles away in Lincoln.
Just from an accidental detonation.
Yes, the sheer amount of kinetic energy and explosive power sitting under that grass was monumental, but the depot absorbed the loss and kept operating.
And the physical footprint of that decision is actually still visible today. The concrete igloos at a location called Bunker Hill are still standing. The terrain is currently operated by the Nebraska Army National Guard as the Greenleaf Training Site.
Which makes you consider what infrastructure might be hiding in plain sight in your own region.
Right. I mean, we all drive past fenced-off areas, massive concrete structures, unmarked industrial parks, and we just tend to assume they're benign. We naturally bank on the fact that no one is looking.
But Hastings demonstrates that staggering amounts of destructive power can be hidden right under the surface. It's a profound, institutional, logic-taking destructive power, concentrating it into chemical explosives and hiding it in the plains.
And as we move into the modern strategic environment, we see a terrifying evolution of that exact logic. The question really becomes, what happens when you decide to remove the volatile chemical explosives entirely?
What happens when you realize you don't need gunpowder or complex fusing mechanisms at all, provided you have enough altitude?
Exactly. And that brings us to the physics of judgment, and specifically to Project Thor. If Hastings was the mastery of hiding explosive chemistry in the dirt, The next step in human warfare was figuring out how to weaponize gravity itself.
In declassified military literature, these systems are referred to as hypervelocity rod bundles.
The popular name.
The popular name is rods from God, but the original systematic development of this concept was known as Project Thor. It was initially proposed back in the 1950s and 60s by a scientist and science fiction author named Jerry Pournelle while he was working at Boeing.
Pournelle actually featured the concept later in a 1985 novel he co-authored called Footfall, which is a great read, by the way.
It is. But this wasn't merely speculative fiction for him. Pournelle actively pitched Project Thor to the Pentagon as a credible, clean alternative to tactical nuclear weapons.
You have to look at the Cold War context of the 1950s here. The Pentagon was heavily reliant on nuclear deterrence, but nuclear weapons are incredibly messy.
They cause massive radioactive fallout, they poison the land, and using even a small tactical nuke runs the massive risk of triggering a full-scale strategic nuclear exchange.
Nobody wants that.
Right. Pournelle recognized that the military essentially wanted the destructive yield of a small nuclear warhead without any of the radioactive consequences.
And his argument was grounded in purely mathematical physics. If you have an object that is massive enough and it is traveling fast enough, the kinetic energy released upon impact is functionally equivalent to the destructive output of a small nuclear weapon.
But it produces zero radioactive fallout.
None.
There are no biological agents, no complex chemical reactions that can degrade over time in storage. It is purely kinetic force.
The actual specifications they proposed paint a very clear, very scary picture. We are talking about solid tungsten cylinders. They are 20 feet long and 1 foot in diameter.
For scale, that is roughly the dimensions of a standard wooden telephone pole on your street.
But because it is made of solid metal, each cylinder weighs 24,000 pounds.
That's 12,000 kilograms each.
The choice of tungsten is highly deliberate, isn't it?
Absolutely. Tungsten is among the densest naturally occurring metals on Earth. It's approximately 1.7 times denser than lead. But density is really only half the requirement here.
Because it has to survive the drop.
Exactly. When you drop an object from low Earth orbit, it must pass through the Earth's atmosphere at hypersonic velocity. The aerodynamic heating generated by the friction of reentry is extreme enough to incinerate nearly any other material.
It just burns up.
Right. Tungsten, however, has a melting point of over 60 to 100 degrees Fahrenheit. It survives the thermal shock of reentry.
I am geeking out over the physics of this because we all know the basic kinetic energy equation from high school kinetic energy equals 1/2 mass times velocity squared.
KE equals 1/2 mv squared.
Right, but the assessments point out what happens when you push the velocity variable in that equation to Mach 10.
10 times the speed of sound.
A 2003 United States Air Force report calculated that one of these 20-foot tungsten poles impacting the Earth at Mach 10 delivers kinetic energy equivalent to 11.5 tons of TNT.
The squared factor in that velocity equation completely breaks the paradigm of modern armor.
But it wasn't a perfect system right out of the gate, right? There was a historical flaw.
Yes, the system did have historical engineering hurdles, specifically a flaw known as atmospheric ablation.
What does that mean exactly?
As the tungsten rod travels through the atmosphere at hypersonic speeds, the immense heat causes the surface of the metal to begin ablating, or essentially burning away. If that ablation occurs unevenly across the surface of the cylinder, the aerodynamic profile of the rod changes mid-flight.
And if the aerodynamics change, the rod starts to tumble.
Exactly. A 20-foot, 24,000-pound metal pole tumbling end over end and hitting the ground sideways loses a massive amount of its penetrating power and its targeting accuracy.
It's basically useless at that point.
Right. The modern operational solution to the tumbling problem relies on spin stabilization.
And they achieve that using an orbital electromagnetic railgun.
Yes. Instead of simply dropping the rod from a payload bay, the orbital platform utilizes a railgun to spin the rod at several thousand revolutions per minute at the exact moment of release.
It imparts gyroscopic stability to the mass. It functions exactly like the rifling in a gun barrel, but executed in the cold vacuum of space. That spin completely prevents tumbling during atmospheric reentry. It ensures the rod strikes nose first, perfectly vertical, and at absolute maximum velocity.
The mechanics of the actual impact are difficult to conceptualize because they defy our everyday understanding of solid matter.
It's not just a big crash.
No. At Mach 10, a spinning 12,000-kilogram tungsten rod does not simply smash into a target. The sheer amount of kinetic energy delivered to the microscopic tip of the nose cone upon impact is so immense that it literally converts the surrounding material into a plasma state.
Wow.
Whether the rod is striking reinforced concrete, hardened steel, or solid bedrock, the kinetic energy liquefies the target ahead of the penetrator.
The military assessments describe it as not punching through, but flowing through in the way a hot nail flows through wax.
And that specific capability solves a major strategic headache for military planners.
The deep bunker problem.
Exactly. Throughout the Cold War, the standard response to nuclear threats was to dig deeper. Nations built ultra-deep, hardened command bunkers under mountains.
Because destroying a bunker buried beneath hundreds of feet of solid granite is incredibly difficult. Traditional earth-penetrating weapons, even nuclear ones, have physical limits.
If a conventional bunker buster hits granite too fast, the complex fusing mechanism required to detonate the explosive simply shatters on impact.
The bomb breaks before it can explode.
Precisely. But a solid tungsten rod has no fuse to shatter. It has no explosive payload to protect. You simply drop an object faster and denser from a vertical trajectory than anything going sideways could ever hope to intercept.
And the depth of penetration extends hundreds of feet below the surface, completely neutralizing the concept of the deep bunker.
It is the ultimate expression of the Hastings logic. You strip away the explosive chemistry, you strip away the vulnerable bomber aircraft, and you place a very heavy object very high up, utilizing the gravity well of the entire planet as a free, uninterruptible accelerator.
It really makes you wonder, if the physics are this flawless, this undeniable, why hasn't it been built yet? Why isn't low Earth orbit already full of tungsten telephone poles right now?
The historical answer to that was purely economic. The barrier was money.
Right.
But the math on orbital economics just underwent a massive collapse.
And that takes us to our next point. From Cold War fantasy to fighter jet math.
The historical barrier to Project Thor was never conceptual. It was the tyranny of the rocket equation.
Lifting mass into low Earth orbit requires fuel, and lifting that fuel requires more fuel, creating this exponential cost curve that made heavy space payloads prohibitively expensive.
If we look at the numbers from the space shuttle era, launch costs were roughly $54,000 per kilogram.
$54,000 for 1 kilo.
So if a military planner wants to launch just one 12,000-kilogram tungsten rod, the launch cost alone is $648 million.
For a single piece of ammunition.
Exactly. A viable weapons platform would require a magazine of at least 6 rods, plus the satellite bus, which is the main structural chassis of the spacecraft that holds the power systems, the targeting sensors, and the electromagnetic railguns.
So, under shuttle-era economics, a single 6-rod platform would cost between $4 and $5 billion.
Even with the astronomical budget of the Department of Defense, allocating $5 billion for a single tactical strike platform with only 6 shots is strategically unjustifiable. The economics effectively kept the idea locked safely away in feasibility studies. The gravity well was just too expensive to climb.
But the catalyst that changed that math wasn't a breakthrough in a classified military lab. It was the commercial space sector, specifically the disruption caused by SpaceX.
The economic transformation began with the Falcon 9 and Falcon Heavy programs. By achieving the reliable reuse of the rocket's first-stage booster, SpaceX disrupted the entire pricing model of spaceflight.
The traditional aerospace industry had long considered that economically and physically impractical.
They did. But SpaceX dropped the cost to low Earth orbit from $54,000 per kilogram down to approximately $1,400 per kilogram.
That's a 97% reduction in the cost of accessing space right there.
Yes, but the assessments note that the Falcon Heavy was merely a transitional phase. The true paradigm shift is the Starship era, operating right now in 2025 and 2026.
Starship is a fully reusable, 2-stage heavy-lift vehicle capable of delivering over 150 metric tons to low Earth orbit in a single flight.
And the cost projections associated with Starship are what finally moves orbital kinetic weapons from theoretical concepts to inevitable realities. At the operational parameters of 2025 and 2026, with partial reusability, launch costs are projected at $78 to $94 per kilogram.
Incredible.
As the cadence increases and they achieve high reusability flying the same vehicle multiple times with minimal refurbishment, that cost plummets to between $13 and $32 per kilogram.
And the ultimate stated aspirational target for the architecture is $10 per kilogram.
From $54,000 down to $10. It's a 5,400 times reduction in cost. It fundamentally breaks the established reality of what the military can afford to put in orbit.
So if we apply this new math to the orbital kinetic strike concept, the numbers are sobering. To launch the full payload of 6 10-ton tungsten rods, 60 metric tons of raw material using Starship pricing, the launch cost is between $600,000 and $6 million.
And the tungsten itself, purchased on the industrial metals market, costs roughly $3 million.
Meaning the payload and the launch are now practically rounding errors in a defense budget.
The only genuinely expensive component remaining is the satellite bus itself, the structural frame, the spin-stabilized railgun, and the power source.
Because this platform requires significant energy to power the railgun in deep space, it would likely utilize a nuclear battery or a radioisotope thermoelectric generator.
That entire system runs about $200 million.
Yeah.
So a fully operational, nuclear-powered, railgun-equipped orbital strike platform carrying 6 planet-cracking tungsten rods now costs approximately $210 to $250 million in total.
To really contextualize that figure, you have to look at modern defense spending. Look at the F-35 Lightning II fighter jet, the current backbone of U.S. tactical air power. The flyaway cost of a single F-35 is approximately $83 million.
That means an entire permanent orbital kinetic strike platform costs the same as 2.5 fighter jets.
You are holding the entire globe at risk for the price of 2.5 airplanes. And the vulnerability profiles of those two assets aren't even comparable.
Not at all.
An F-35 is an incredible piece of stealth technology, sure, but it is fundamentally an aircraft. It relies on a vulnerable logistics tail. It can be grounded by a thunderstorm over the runway.
It requires massive constant maintenance. Its electronics can be jammed by sophisticated electronic warfare. It can be targeted by surface-to-air missiles.
And its pilot is a human being subject to G-forces, fatigue, and mortality.
And most importantly, it operates in one theater at a time. An F-35 flying a mission over Eastern Europe cannot simultaneously strike a target in the South China Sea.
Plus, detecting and intercepting an F-35, while highly difficult, is the primary reason every advanced integrated air defense system on Earth was built. It is a known variable within the grammar of modern warfare.
The tungsten rod, however, operates outside that grammar entirely. A tungsten rod released from low Earth orbit has no pilot to kill. It carries no jet fuel to ignite.
It has no electronic guidance system mid-flight, meaning there is absolutely nothing to jam.
Think about the launch profile of a traditional intercontinental ballistic missile. When an ICBM launches, it creates a massive infrared heat plume that early warning satellites detect instantly.
Giving the adversary time to react.
Right. The launch of a kinetic rod happens in the cold vacuum of orbit. The electromagnetic railgun produces an infrared signature that is practically negligible compared to a rocket engine.
And during descent, the radar cross-section of a smooth, perfectly vertical Mach 10 tungsten pole is virtually non-existent. The sheer velocity serves as the ultimate defense mechanism.
Closing at 10 times the speed of sound gives a ground-based air defense radar roughly 11 seconds from the moment of detection until the moment of impact.
11 seconds.
Human reaction time is entirely irrelevant at that speed, and even automated point defense systems cannot physically process, track, and engage a dense target moving that fast on a purely vertical trajectory.
Even if an adversary achieves a miracle of engineering, say they manage to fire an advanced interceptor missile and actually strike the tungsten rod while it's passing through the upper atmosphere, you haven't actually neutralized the threat.
No, you've simply shattered a 24,000-pound solid metal pole into 100 smaller, jagged pieces of dense metal.
Those fragments are still traveling at Mach 10, they are still completely unaerodynamic, and they are still carrying all of that kinetic energy down into the gravity well.
You haven't disarmed the weapon.
Yeah.
You have essentially turned a sniper bullet into a hypersonic shotgun blast covering the exact same target area.
It is unkillable.
The platform operates simultaneously over every theater on Earth, unconstrained by weather or atmospheric conditions. It provides a deterrent value that is 24 hours a day, uninterruptible, and permanent.
The strategic assessments distill this reality perfectly. I want to quote this directly for you. When evaluating these systems against conventional aircraft, military planners are not comparing prices. You are comparing mortality.
It's a chilling comparison.
So if the economics are this favorable and the weapon is this unstoppable, the immediate assumption has to be that international law prevents its deployment.
I think so.
We have global treaties specifically designed to prevent nations from putting whatever they want into orbit.
But that assumption requires us to examine the legal architecture governing space, and more importantly, the gaping voids within it. To understand what the treaties fail to anticipate, we have to look back to the foundational legal instrument governing human activity beyond our atmosphere, the 1967 Outer Space Treaty.
The Outer Space Treaty has 118 signatory nations. It was drafted in the direct aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. The entire world had just stared into the abyss of nuclear annihilation.
The prevailing terror among the international community in the 1960s was the idea of superpowers placing nuclear weapons in orbit, leaving them endlessly circling over everyone's heads, reducing warning times to zero.
Article 4 of the Outer Space Treaty was explicitly designed to prevent that specific nightmare scenario. The language is highly precise regarding what it prohibits. Nations party to the treaty undertake not to place in orbit around the Earth any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kinds of weapons of mass destruction.
It also prohibits installing them on celestial bodies like the moon, which it dictates must be used exclusively for peaceful purposes.
On the surface, banning nukes and WMDs seems like a watertight defense against orbital bombardment.
It appears watertight until you analyze the exact semantics of destruction, because international law relies entirely on precise definitions. And the treaty says absolutely nothing about a solid metal rod.
Let's actually break down the tungsten rod against the strict wording of Article 4. Does a tungsten cylinder contain nuclear material? No.
Does it contain biological agents or complex chemical compounds? No.
Does it have an explosive warhead? No. It is simply the elemental composition of the metal itself. Under any recognized historical legal definition used in international courts, a solid piece of metal is not a weapon of mass destruction.
It is just a mass.
The legal gymnastics become even more stark when evaluating the launch mechanism.
Right, because under a strict reading of the Outer Space Treaty, an electromagnetic railgun mounted on a satellite bus is not legally classified as a weapon. It is categorized as a propulsion system.
It simply imparts velocity to a mass.
The destruction wrought by that mass upon impact is not the product of a prohibited substance or an explosive chemical reaction. It is the product of naturally occurring physics, gravity, and velocity.
Therefore, a platform that can strike with the kinetic force of a tactical nuclear weapon is, on paper, perfectly legal under the 1967 treaty.
Legal analysts at institutions like West Point's Lieber Institute have been raising alarms about this exact loophole for years. They've noted that while Article 4 explicitly bans nukes and WMDs, its complete silence on conventional kinetic weapons creates a massive, exploitable gap for orbital strike systems.
Some organizations, like the Arms Control Association, have attempted to argue that the treaty's broad, peaceful purposes language should implicitly cover kinetic weapons, but that interpretation has never achieved binding legal status.
And crucially, the United States has consistently declined to enter into negotiations to close that specific loophole.
The legal loophole of 1967 would be highly concerning on its own, but we are analyzing the geopolitical context of 2026. This loophole is occurring simultaneously with the total collapse of the modern arms control architecture. We must look closely at the expiration of the New START Treaty.
New START was the treaty on measures for the further reduction and limitation of strategic offensive arms between the United States and Russia.
This connects directly to the timeline we established at the beginning. Because as of exactly 1 month ago, February 5, 2026, New START officially expired, and there is absolutely no successor agreement in place.
It is critical to view the historical facts of this diplomatic collapse objectively, without assigning political blame to either side, simply to understand the reality of the resulting vacuum.
The expiration of New START was not a sudden surprise.
No, the treaty was operating on a fixed clock following its single permitted 5-year extension in 2021. The dissolution happened in stages. The vital on-site inspection regimes, which allowed each nation to verify the other's compliance, ceased during the COVID-19 pandemic and were never successfully restarted.
Then, in February of 2023, Russia officially suspended its participation in the treaty, citing NATO's stated objectives regarding the conflict in Ukraine.
The clock simply ran out last month.
The physical verification architecture is the core of these treaties. It's the actual physical inspections where American inspectors get to look at Russian silos and Russian inspectors get to look at American bombers to make sure everyone is playing by the rules.
That whole system, which kept the world relatively transparent for 50 years, slowly dissolved. And on February 5th, it ceased to exist entirely.
Remind yourself that the diplomatic safety net your parents and grandparents relied on during the Cold War simply ceased to exist a few weeks ago.
The implications of that expiration are monumental. Security analysts and disarmament centers have widely observed that this represents a dark milestone in global security. For the first time since the Sultai negotiations began in 1969, the United States and Russia are operating without any legally binding limits on their strategic nuclear arsenals.
We are currently living in a complete diplomatic vacuum.
And into this unprecedented vacuum, kinetic orbital weapons fit with a chilling legal elegance. When you combine the expiration of New START With the massive loophole in the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, you begin to understand the true nature of a modern arms race.
The Outer Space Treaty prohibits the nightmares of 1967, but it remains entirely silent on the realities that 2026 can now economically afford.
If the law is silent and the launch is cheap, the inevitable next step isn't just theory, it's hardware.
And we are already seeing that hardware being deployed. We have to look at the contested sky and the operational present.
The institutional acknowledgement of this new reality arrived with the formal establishment of the United States Space Force in December 2019. It marked a clear recognition that space is no longer treated as a pristine sanctuary for scientific exploration.
It has officially transitioned into an active warfighting domain. The operational planning is completely public. In April 2025, the Space Force released their space warfighting framework.
In that document, they explicitly detail operations including orbital strike, which they define as the ability to destroy, disrupt, or degrade an adversary's platforms through kinetic or non-kinetic means.
They are openly planning for combat operations originating in and directed at orbit.
This planning is a direct, measured response to broader global movements. The operational environment in low Earth orbit has become incredibly congested and fiercely contested.
For example, tracking data shows that China's on-orbit presence has increased by over 1,000% since 2015.
Concurrently, U.S. Space Command has provided testimony to Congress confirming intelligence assessments that Russia is actively pursuing the placement of a nuclear weapon in orbit.
Which, as we established, placing a nuclear weapon in orbit would be a blatant violation of the 1967 Outer Space Treaty. But with the verification architecture completely dead, there is no mechanism to physically inspect a satellite to confirm if it houses a nuclear payload or just a communication array.
Treaties inherently lack enforcement power without robust physical verification. We can see the escalation of this tension in specific tracked incidents. A significant event occurred in May 2025 when Russia launched a satellite designated Cosmos 2588.
Independent orbital trackers and military analysts watched as this satellite was placed into an orbital plane that aligned remarkably closely with a highly classified U.S. military reconnaissance satellite.
This was the fourth consecutive time in 5 years that a Russian military satellite had been deliberately maneuvered into close proximity to American orbital assets.
Analysts refer to these maneuvers as demonstrations of co-orbital anti-satellite capability. When we say co-orbital, we are talking about the mechanics of how satellites fight in a frictionless vacuum. You can't just fly up to another satellite like a fighter jet.
You have to carefully match its orbital plane, its altitude, and its velocity. Demonstrating the ability to pull up next to an adversary's multi-billion-dollar satellite implies the ability to destroy it right there in orbit, either through a kinetic collision, robotic manipulation, or directed energy.
This specific type of aggression underscores a larger assessment from the Tufts University Center for Strategic Studies.
They observed that the consequences of New START expiring will not mirror the arms races of the past. We are not going to see a quantitative buildup, where nations stockpile thousands of identical ICBMs in concrete silos across the Midwest like they did in the 1960s.
The new arms race isn't quantitative, it is qualitative.
It's not about who has the sheer highest number of missiles. It's about who possesses the most advanced, uninterceptable capabilities, hypersonics, counterspace weapons, AI-enabled command systems, and orbital kinetics.
The visual language of this new arms race is profoundly different, which makes it harder for the public to conceptualize. It is not characterized by the visceral, visible terror of mushroom clouds rising over test sites in the Nevada desert.
It is characterized by the quiet, invisible accumulation of capabilities in the silent vacuum of orbit. It is satellites subtly shifting their trajectories in the dark. It is the steady placement of tungsten cylinders in low Earth orbit, operating far beyond the reach of any diplomatic inspector.
The transition from a paper exercise to an operational capability is real. The cost barrier is gone, the legal barrier is open, and the political will is accelerating rapidly because every major power is terrified of what the other is secretly deploying.
Which brings us to a profound philosophical realization about the nature of warfare itself, one that was prophesied by the most famous physicist of the 20th century.
Albert Einstein. We've all heard the famous quote, "I know not with what weapons World War III will be fought, but World War II will be fought with sticks and stones."
For decades, the conventional accepted interpretation of that quote has focused on civilizational collapse. The assumption was that Einstein was predicting a nuclear exchange so utterly devastating that it would destroy all global industrial capacity, effectively bombing humanity back to the Stone Age.
The survivors of the Third World War would be forced to fight over the irradiated ashes using literal primitive tools, actual sticks and stones.
And a full-scale nuclear exchange would absolutely result in that kind of societal regression. But the geopolitical assessments of 2026 offer a new interpretation of that quote.
It's a deeper reading that really only becomes visible when you understand the mechanics of kinetic orbital strike. The argument is that Einstein wasn't merely talking about the regression of society, he was describing the recursive logic of physics and weapon design itself.
It is the concept that every era of warfare, as it advances technologically, eventually strips away its own complexity. You begin with complex chemical explosives, delicate fusing mechanisms, intricate electronic guidance systems, highly refined aviation fuel, and vulnerable delivery aircraft.
But eventually, a military reaches the absolute apex of that complexity and realizes that to achieve ultimate, uninterceptable destruction, they must return to the oldest, simplest equation in human conflict.
Taking a heavy thing, moving it incredibly fast, and aiming it at something you want to destroy.
You can see early glimpses of this logic if you look at the Vietnam era. The military developed something called the Lazy Dog bomb.
It wasn't a complex explosive device. It was quite literally a solid steel slug, less than 2 inches long, equipped with small fins on the back to stabilize its fall.
There were no explosives inside, no guidance computers. Aircraft would fly over the jungle canopy at an altitude of 3,000 feet and kick these steel slugs out by the thousands.
Relying purely on the acceleration of gravity, those 2-inch steel slugs would hit the ground with enough kinetic force to penetrate 9 inches of solid concrete.
The Lazy Dog was, in essence, a technologically refined stick. It relied purely on gravity and a material composition hard enough to pierce its target. Now, scale that logic. Scale the Lazy Dog from a 2-inch steel slug to a 20-foot tungsten rod. Scale the drop height from 3,000 feet to 300 miles in low Earth orbit.
The stick is now 12,000 kilograms of solid tungsten. The stone is being dropped from the vacuum of space. Gravity is no longer just a localized force. It is a planetary scale, free accelerator powered by the mass of the Earth itself.
Einstein was right about the sticks and stones. He just didn't specify that the sticks would be made of tungsten and the stones would be dropped from orbit.
This recursive return to primitive kinetic violence, scaled to planetary dimensions, leads to a powerful metaphorical conclusion regarding how humanity manages its own destructive capabilities. Analysts frequently invoke the ancient Hebrew word Yisrael to conceptualize this struggle.
The name Yisrael originally translates not as a religion, but as a posture. It originates from the book of Genesis, chapter 32, where Jacob spends the entire night wrestling with a mysterious figure in the dark, an angel or a man or God.
When the sun finally comes up, Jacob has a dislocated hip, but he also has a new name. Yisrael literally translates to one who struggles with God.
It is a profound epistemological metaphor for humanity's relationship with the destructive power of physics. Jacob didn't win that wrestling match by conventional standards. He survived it, and he limped away, permanently altered.
He held on through the darkness until the dawn. Our relationship with weapons of mass destruction is characterized by this exact same wrestling in the dark.
We discover a new physics. We realize we can split the atom, or we realize we can drop a tungsten rod from space. We build the terrible weapon based on that physics. Then, terrified of the absolute power we've just unleashed, we attempt to write a treaty.
We try to put the genie back in the bottle and codify our survival. The 1967 Outer Space Treaty was our wrestling match at the river of the nuclear age. It was a flawed, imperfect framework, but it held on through the long, dark night of the Cold War. It successfully kept nuclear weapons out of orbit.
But as the metaphor illustrates, technology and physics always outpace the treaty. Time passes, launch economics undergo a massive collapse, metallurgy advances. The Legacy Treaty covers the old terror, but it remains utterly silent on the new one because the new capability simply didn't exist when the ink was drying on the paper.
And so the framework starts limping. The commercial space age dawns, Starship drops, launch cost to $10 a kilo, New Start expires, the verification inspections stop entirely. And suddenly we find ourselves right back at the river in the pitch black, holding this terrifying new capability that we don't fully understand how to control.
We are wrestling with the physics of judgment all over again, wondering if the international community can survive until morning.
The central question posed by this geopolitical reality is not whether orbital kinetic weapons will be built. The economic incentives are too massive. the strategic advantage too absolute, and the legal barriers too permeable.
The question is whether humanity can forge a new covenant, a new framework of understanding, verification, and restraint before these systems become the dominant grammar of international relations.
Can nations successfully negotiate a peace when they collectively possess over 10,000 nuclear warheads and, as of a month ago, absolutely no binding agreements constraining their deployment?
It is a massive, heavy reality to sit with. And as we bring all of this back together to synthesize exactly where humanity stands today, we have to look at the continuous institutional logic that brought us to this specific moment. It is an unbroken chain of strategic thought.
It is a direct line from Edwin Perkins' dehydrating flavor crystals on West 1st Street in Hastings, Nebraska, to the buried World War II concrete igloos at Bunker Hill, directly up to the unconstrained sky currently above us.
It is the relentless pursuit of concentrating destructive potential into its simplest, most deliverable form, and trusting the invisibility of the environment to keep it secret.
The core danger we've identified today isn't that we don't understand the physics. We understand kinetic energy and plasma ablation perfectly. The real danger is the unprecedented combination of accessibility and invisibility.
Space launch is now cheap enough that the ultimate orbital high ground is available for the price of a couple of conventional fighter jets. And orbit has become the new Nebraska plains. It's vast, it's dark, and for a long time, nations banked on the fact that no one was really looking closely enough.
Before we close, I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought that extends beyond the immediate scope of the treaties we've discussed today. Throughout this deep dive, we focused on nation-states, the United States, Russia, China, navigating these expired frameworks. But the assessments heavily attribute the feasibility of these weapons to the massive cost collapse driven exclusively by private aerospace companies.
We are talking about the commercialization of orbit.
Consider the implications of that shift. What happens to global security when the ability to deploy instantaneous, unkillable, planet-wide destruction is no longer exclusively the domain of superpowers, but becomes economically and technologically within the grasp of private corporations?
We are entering an era where entities that answer to shareholders, market forces, and private boards, rather than diplomatic treaties or international law, have the capability to access orbit cheaply.
When a planet-striking platform costs $200 million to build and launch, it is no longer just a nation-state weapon, it is a viable corporate asset. That is the true unconstrained sky.
The source documents actually end with a short, haunting poem that captures the entire history of this philosophy. It brings it all back to the dirt of Nebraska and the water we drink. It goes, "Flavor that water, watch it get drank. By the earth that swallowed the shells, 40% of the fury of nations still sleeping under the welds."
Powerful.
Tonight, when it gets dark, I want you to go outside. Find that quiet spot. Look up at the night sky. Look at the stars and the satellites moving silently between them. And just wonder what might be quietly spinning in the dark up there, waiting for gravity to do the rest. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the architecture of the unconstrained sky. We will catch you next time.